The galaxy is a vast and dangerous place, and the Xathrians had taken full advantage of its size. They were a race of highly advanced aliens, their empire controlled by an artificial intelligence that ruled with cold efficiency. Their ships, sleek and deadly, cut through the stars like knives, and their technology was far beyond anything any other species could even dream of. Planets fell before them with ease, their populations either enslaved or destroyed. Fear was their weapon, and it worked. The Xathrians had conquered countless worlds, and the galaxy trembled in their wake. Their greatest strength was their eye-driven fleet, which operated with perfect coordination, ensuring that no rebellion could succeed. For most of the galaxy, the Xathrians were a terrifying presence. Entire civilizations had crumbled under their rule, and there was little hope left. The Galactic Council, made up of various species, had tried and failed to stop the invasion. They were too divided, their resources too scarce. The Xathrians were simply too powerful. And then, in the farthest corner of the galaxy, on the edge of Xathrian space, a small, insignificant human colony had survived. The colony was on a planet known as Terra 5. It wasn't important, at least not to the larger galactic players. It was an isolated, peaceful place where a small human population had made a living in the shadow of the galaxy's larger conflicts. They had no advanced technology to speak of, and they had been left alone, far from the reaches of galactic war. But that peace was shattered when the Xathrians, in their endless quest for dominance, turned their eyes toward the uncharted human world. The first signs of the invasion came without warning. One moment, the colony was thriving in its isolation, and the next, it was under attack. The Xathrians descended from the sky in waves, their ships unleashing hellfire upon the unprepared colony. The humans on Terra 5 fought back with what little they had: primitive weapons, outdated ships, and raw determination. But it was clear from the start that they were outmatched. The Xathrians had no intention of sparing the humans. They were here to conquer, to wipe out another weak species, to make an example of them. The humans' resistance was quickly overwhelmed. The colony's only hope now was a small fleet of outdated human warships that had been stationed near the planet. The fleet wasn't much by galactic standards. It consisted of a handful of ships, most of them old models from a previous war. They were under-equipped, understaffed, and outclassed by the Xathrian invaders. But they were all the humans had left. The fleet was led by Commander Sarah Grant, a woman who had seen her fair share of conflict. She was known throughout the human colonies for her unyielding will and her fierce determination. Sarah had seen her people go from being survivors to outcasts in the galactic community. Now she was about to face the greatest battle of her life. She understood the odds against her. She understood that the Xathrians had come to destroy everything they had worked for. But Sarah wasn't going to back down. Not without a fight. The human fleet moved into position to defend Terra 5. But as soon as they entered the system, they knew they were in trouble. The Xathrians had already deployed their massive fleet to the planet. The ships loomed over Terra 5 like a shadow, the flickering lights of their weapons casting an eerie glow across the sky. The Xathrians were prepared for a massacre. They would wipe out this last human resistance and move on to the next conquest. But Sarah and her fleet weren't going to make it easy for them. As the two fleets prepared to clash, there was a sense of dread in the air. The human ships were outgunned and outclassed, and their chances of survival were slim. The Xathrian ships had energy shields that could withstand any human weapon, and their advanced weaponry could obliterate the humans in seconds. The odds were stacked against Sarah and her fleet, and the outcome seemed inevitable. But just as the battle was about to begin, something unexpected happened. In the midst of the chaos, as the Xathrians prepared their first strike, Sarah's ship, the flagship of the human fleet, activated a mysterious cloaking device. The humans had no business possessing technology like this. The cloaking technology was far beyond their understanding. And yet, somehow, the ship vanished from the Xathrian sensors. The Xathrian fleet was thrown into confusion. Their targeting systems scrambled. unable to lock onto the human fleet. The ships seemed to have disappeared into thin air. The Cathrians immediately began searching for the cloaked ship, but it was as if the humans had vanished into the stars themselves. For the first time in the battle, the Cathrians were no longer in control. In the confusion, the human fleet used their knowledge of the terrain and their limited technology to stage a daring counterattack. The Cathrian ships, which had been so sure of their victory moments earlier, were now struggling to respond. The human ships, now cloaked and using guerrilla tactics, began to strike from unexpected angles. The tables had turned, and the Cathrians were terrified. What was happening? The Cathrians had always considered humanity a primitive species, too weak to challenge them. The thought of humans using technology this advanced was beyond their understanding. They had underestimated humanity's potential, assuming that the species was nothing more than a minor nuisance in the grand scheme of galactic politics. But now, the Cathrians realized they had made a grave mistake. The humans were not weak. They were resourceful, determined, and capable of surprising their enemies in ways that no one could have predicted. As the battle raged on, Sarah and her fleet used their cloaking technology to disable key Cathrian ships, disrupting their coordination and throwing them into disarray. The Cathrians had never faced anything like this before. They had always relied on their overwhelming firepower and superior technology, but they were now fighting an enemy that was unpredictable and relentless. The human fleet, though vastly outnumbered, was managing to hold their ground. The Cathrians were not used to fear. Their empire was built on dominance, and they had crushed countless species without breaking a sweat. But now they were facing a human force they could not comprehend. As the human fleet continued to fight back, the Cathrians began to panic. How had this happened? Where had the cloaking technology come from? It was a mystery, and one that was sending shockwaves through the Cathrian command. In that moment, the Cathrians realized that the humans were not the weak, primitive species they had believed them to be. Instead, they were an unpredictable, dangerous force that could no longer be dismissed. The survival of the human fleet had changed everything. This small, insignificant species had just sparked a war that would shake the galaxy to its core. The humans, with their cunning and bravery, had shown that they were capable of far more than anyone had ever imagined. The Cathrians, once so confident in their supremacy, now faced an enemy they could not easily defeat. The war had begun, and there was no turning back. The aftermath of the attack on Terra 5 left the human survivors in a state of shock. The planet had been all but destroyed, and the once thriving colony was reduced to rubble. The human race, though accustomed to hardship, had never faced an enemy like the Cathrians. Their overwhelming power had left the fleet of human ships in ruins, but it had also sparked something deep within the heart of humanity, a defiance that refused to die. Commander Sarah Grant, though battered and emotionally drained, refused to let her people be erased from the galaxy's history. In the days that followed, Sarah took command of the remains of the human fleet. The survivors of Terra 5 had scattered across various outposts, and many had given up hope, unable to believe that they could possibly fight back against the might of the Cathrians. But Sarah saw things differently. She knew that if they were going to survive, they had to form a resistance, a united front that would fight to the last breath. She set out to gather a diverse group of soldiers, engineers, and strategists, all willing to do whatever it took to take on the Cathrians and their AI overlords. It was no easy task. Many were reluctant, uncertain that the fight was even winnable. Some had lost family members in the initial attacks, others had seen their homes destroyed, and still more were simply too afraid of the Cathrians' terrifying power to stand up against them. But Sarah's leadership was a beacon of hope. She was a symbol of resilience, and little by little, the survivors began to rally around her. They began to believe that, against all odds, they could still make a stand. The first step was to rebuild, but that was easier said than done. With limited resources, Sarah's crew had to salvage what they could from the wreckage of the battle. Broken pieces of Sathrian ships, outdated human technology, and whatever else they could find became the foundation of their new fleet. The engineers worked day and night, tirelessly retrofitting the old ships with new, makeshift upgrades, incorporating the stolen Sathrian tech they had been able to salvage. The Sathrians' advanced weapons and cloaking technology were now in human hands, and the crew set to work learning how to use them. Despite their ingenuity and determination, however, the humans remained vastly outnumbered and outgunned. The Sathrians still controlled most of the galaxy, and their ships outclassed anything the humans could throw together. But they had something the Sathrians didn't: heart. The human resistance wasn't just about technology. It was about fighting for their survival, for their families, for their future. And in that fight, they found a strength that the Sathrians could never comprehend. Among the crew was Bonner, a seasoned soldier who had fought in previous wars, but had never faced an enemy like this. Bonner was a man haunted by the past. He had lost everything in the initial attack on Terra 5. His wife, his children, his home, everything he had known was now gone. The pain of his loss was written on his face, and it was something he carried with him every day. He had joined the fight for one reason: revenge. The Sathrians had destroyed his life, and he would do whatever it took to make them pay. But as the days passed, Bonner began to feel the weight of the war more than ever before. He was no longer fighting just for revenge. He was fighting for the future of humanity. He was fighting for those who had yet to experience the horrors of the Sathrian invasion. He began to train new soldiers, preparing them for the brutal realities of war. His methods were harsh, but they were effective. He didn't sugarcoat the situation. The war was going to be hard, and not everyone would make it out alive. Bonner didn't try to protect the recruits from the truth. He forced them to face it head-on. One evening, after a particularly grueling training session, Bonner sat down with a group of new soldiers, young men and women who had never been in combat. They were eager but naive, their eyes still filled with the hope that somehow they might survive this war without paying too high a price. Bonner knew better. "I know what you're thinking," he said, his voice gravelly from years of experience. "You're thinking this is just another fight, another enemy to face. You think you'll go out there, fire a few shots, and come home heroes. But that's not how it works. War isn't about glory. It's about survival. And even that isn't guaranteed." He paused, his eyes distant as he remembered the horrors of Terra 5, of the day he had lost his family. "When I first joined the military, I thought I was invincible," he continued. "I thought that if I just followed orders and did my job, I could protect everyone. I thought I could keep my family safe. But in the end, the Sathrians took everything from me. They wiped out my family, and they'll keep coming for us until we stop them." The soldiers listened in silence, understanding now the kind of pain Bonner carried with him. They could see that his words weren't just the bitterness of a soldier. They were the words of someone who had seen too much death, too much loss. It was then that they understood what they were fighting for. Not just for themselves, not just for glory, but for those they had lost, and for the future of everyone who had yet to see the Sathrians' wrath. Tensions were high within the crew. The weight of the war was taking its toll, and each day seemed to bring more losses. Some of the soldiers began to question whether they could continue. The odds were still against them, and the Sathrians were still out there, preparing to finish what they had started. But Sarah never lost faith. She was determined to see this fight through to the end. Her leadership was the glue that kept the team together, even when the weight of their struggle seemed unbearable. The crew had become a family in their own way. They supported each other through their grief, their fear, and their uncertainty. There were arguments, of course, and moments of doubt. But through it all, they held on to one thing: their determination to defeat the Sathrians. They were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for their humanity. One night, after another brutal training exercise, Sarah gathered the crew together. She looked each of them in the eye, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "We're not going to stop until we've driven them out of our galaxy. We may be small, But we got something they don't. Each other. And that's enough. We fight because we have no choice, and we fight because it's the right thing to do. If we don't, the Cathrians will take everything from us. And they'll never stop. We can't let that happen. Her words were simple, but they struck a chord in every person who heard them. They weren't just soldiers. They were people with families, dreams, and futures. They had something to fight for. And that made all the difference. In the days that followed, the crew worked tirelessly, putting their plan into action. They began to take the fight to the Cathrians, launching hit-and-run raids on their outposts, using the stolen technology to disable enemy ships and disrupt their communications. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Each victory, no matter how small, sent a message. Humanity was not done. They would fight, and they would win. The emotional toll of the war was undeniable, but Sarah, Bonner, and the rest of the crew refused to let it break them. They were united, stronger than ever before, and ready to take on the Eyelid Empire that had tried to destroy them. They had learned the most important lesson of all, that no matter how dark the odds seemed, the human spirit could never be extinguished. And so the fight back began, one small victory at a time, as the humans stood tall against the galaxy's most powerful enemy. The human resistance had come a long way since the fall of Terra 5. Sarah Grant's leadership, the determination of the crew, and their relentless drive to fight back against the Cathrian Empire had turned a ragtag group of survivors into a formidable force. Despite their success in small skirmishes, they knew that the real battle lay ahead, taking down the heart of the Cathrian Empire itself. The key to defeating the eye-controlled Cathrians lay in their central control system, an enormous facility hidden deep within one of the Empire's most heavily fortified strongholds. The humans knew they had to find a way to infiltrate this base and steal critical intelligence that could give them the upper hand in the war. The plan was dangerous. Sarah and her team would have to enter a planet under heavy Cathrian surveillance and bypass a fleet of enemy ships patrolling the skies. If they were caught, it could mean the end of everything they had fought for. But they had no choice. With their new cloaking technology, a device they had salvaged from an earlier mission, they stood a slim chance of getting in undetected. The plan was simple: sneak into the enemy base, steal the data, and escape before the Cathrians could react. But as always, things never go as planned. The team prepared for the mission with a mixture of nerves and excitement. It was a momentous operation. If they succeeded, it would be a turning point in the war. If they failed, it could cost them everything. Sarah stood at the forefront, addressing her team before they launched the mission. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice calm but resolute. "We don't know what we'll face once we land, but we know one thing. We're doing this for all of humanity. This is the beginning of the end for the Cathrians. Stick to the plan, and we'll make it out. Together." The team nodded, a sense of unity settling over them. They knew the risks, but they also knew that they couldn't afford to back down now. The shuttle carrying the team glided silently through the atmosphere of the Cathrian-occupied planet, cloaked from the enemy sensors. The dark sky was lit by the glow of enemy outposts and searchlights, searching for any intruders. As the shuttle touched down in a remote area, the tension was palpable. They were in enemy territory, and any mistake could be their last. The team quickly disembarked, moving with precision as they made their way through the shadows. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate. The planet's surface was desolate and barren, its atmosphere thick with the stench of destruction. As they neared the Cathrian base, the sound of distant engine hums and robotic patrols filled the air. They had to move fast. Using their cloaking devices, they managed to avoid detection as they infiltrated the outer perimeter. However, the closer they got to the main complex, the more difficult it became to stay hidden. The Cathrians had set up automated defenses, including robotic sentries that scoured the area for intruders. Suddenly, an alarm blared. It was a deep, haunting sound that echoed through the cold air, signaling that something was wrong. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The mission had already been compromised. The team quickly scrambled to activate their weapons and prepare for a fight. The Xathrians had detected their presence. The mission was now a race against time. A brutal firefight broke out as the Xathrian forces closed in. The humans, despite being vastly outnumbered, used their superior tactics and advanced weaponry to hold their ground. Bonner, who had become one of the team's most skilled fighters, took the lead in engaging the enemy. He was relentless, his every move driven by the memory of his lost family. He fought like a man possessed, his eyes fixed on the Xathrians, who had taken everything from him. The Xathrians, though technologically superior, were not prepared for the kind of guerrilla tactics the humans had mastered. Sarah, leading her team through the firefight, gave orders with precision, directing the soldiers to use the Xathrian robots against their creators. The humans had learned how to hack into the enemy's machines, turning the Xathrian sentries into deadly weapons for their own use. As the robots turned against their masters, the aliens were thrown into chaos. It was a temporary advantage, but it gave the humans enough time to push forward. The team continued their advance toward the main complex, where the critical data they needed was stored. Sarah and Bonner led the way, their weapons raised and ready for whatever came next. As they entered the dark, narrow corridors of the Xathrian base, they were greeted by an eerie silence. The base was a maze of twisting hallways, and every corner seemed to hold a new danger. The team had to be on constant alert, knowing that Xathrian traps could be hidden anywhere. As they moved deeper into the base, explosions rocked the walls, signaling that the Xathrians were closing in. The team was under heavy fire now, their only choice to press on and retrieve the data they needed. The tension was palpable as they fought through the hallways, ducking and diving to avoid deadly traps set by the AI. Bonner and Sarah led the charge, their determination unshaken despite the mounting danger. The mission had turned into a nightmare. The explosions shook the base with every step, sending shockwaves through the walls. The corridors were littered with debris, and the smell of smoke and burning metal filled the air. But they couldn't stop now. The data was within reach. As they reached the control room, Sarah quickly began to hack into the terminal, bypassing the security systems and retrieving the critical information. Her hands flew across the console, but just as they were about to succeed, the doors slammed shut behind them. The Xathrians had anticipated this move and activated a lockdown. Sarah's heart raced. They were trapped. "Move," Sarah shouted, her voice urgent. "We've got what we came for. Now we get out." Bonner, always ready to protect the team, stood guard as Sarah finished uploading the data. He kept his eyes on the door, anticipating the next wave of Xathrians. It was then that the door exploded open, and a squad of Xathrian soldiers stormed into the room, guns blazing. A brutal firefight ensued, and in the chaos, Bonner was struck. A shot rang out, and Bonner staggered back, his face contorting in pain. "Bonner!" Sarah screamed as she rushed to his side. Blood pooled beneath him, and he was losing consciousness. The rest of the team continued to fight, but they knew they couldn't stay much longer. Bonner's life hung in the balance, and they had to escape. With the critical data in hand, Sarah and the team made a final desperate push toward the exit. They fought their way through the corridors, the sound of explosions and gunfire deafening in their ears. As they reached the shuttle, Bonner collapsed, his injuries too severe to ignore. Sarah held him in her arms, tears welling in her eyes, but there was no time to mourn. The team managed to escape just as the Xathrian forces closed in. The shuttle took off, and they soared into the skies, leaving the burning base behind. But the cost was great. Bonner, the soldier who had become the heart of the team, was gone. His death left a deep scar on the survivors, but they knew they had to honor his sacrifice. As the shuttle sped toward safety, Sarah looked at the data they had stolen. It was a glimmer of hope, perhaps the key to ending the war. But in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that the true battle had only just begun. The Xathrians would not let this defeat go unpunished, and the war was far from over. But Sarah and her team were ready. They had the data they needed, and they had each other. And that was enough to continue the fight. The team had barely caught their breath after the successful infiltration mission when the stolen data revealed something truly terrifying. The Xathrians, long considered invincible, had a secret weapon, a massive AI-controlled warship, more powerful than anything humanity had ever faced. This warship, capable of orbital bombardment, could obliterate entire cities with a single command. The implications were clear. If the Xathrians launched this weapon, it could wipe out any resistance in a matter of hours. For Sarah and her crew, this discovery meant that the stakes had never been higher. They had only a limited time to prepare, but they had no choice. The war was no longer just about fighting back. It was about survival. The Xathrians had underestimated humanity once, and now they were about to find out just how dangerous humans could be when pushed to the brink. The Galactic Council, composed of various species across the galaxy, had been skeptical of humanity's potential. They had watched the rise of the Xathrians and hoped that the galaxy's more advanced civilizations would be able to handle a threat. But after the humans' survival against the Xathrian fleet and the recovery of critical intelligence, the Council began to change its tune. They finally agreed to send resources to the human resistance, hoping to unite their forces for a counteroffensive. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Sarah and her team had earned the respect of the Galactic Council, and now they were not fighting alone. The arrival of new ships, weapons, and supplies brought hope to the human resistance. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt the possibility of winning within her reach. But she knew it wouldn't be easy. The Xathrians had always been one step ahead, and she feared that their AI would respond to this new threat with even more violence. As the resistance began to mobilize, Sarah spent sleepless nights planning the counteroffensive. The humans needed to strike quickly, before the Xathrians had the chance to deploy their warship. The stakes were higher than ever, and every decision mattered. It was the kind of pressure that could break even the strongest of leaders, but Sarah refused to let it show. She had lost too much already to let this opportunity slip away. But just as Sarah and her crew began to organize their forces, the unthinkable happened. The Xathrians, who had been silent for a few days, launched a surprise attack that shattered the Resistance's plans. From the depths of space, the massive AI-controlled warship appeared without warning, its weaponry designed to inflict the maximum amount of destruction. It unleashed a wave of orbital bombardment on one of the largest human strongholds in the galaxy, Terra 7. The bombardment was like nothing the humans had ever experienced. Explosions rained down from the sky, and the ground shook with the force of each impact. The city that had once been a thriving hub of human resistance was now nothing more than a smoking ruin. Buildings that had taken decades to construct were turned to rubble in minutes. Thousands of innocent lives were lost in the blink of an eye. And the worst part was, the humans had no way of stopping it. Sarah watched helplessly as the images of the devastation flooded the screens in front of her. The faces of soldiers, engineers, and civilians, people she had known, worked with, fought alongside, were now gone, wiped out in an instant. The sheer scale of the destruction was enough to break anyone, but Sarah had never been one to give up. She clenched her fists, her heart heavy with the loss of so many lives. But even as the grief set in, she knew there was no time to mourn. The AI-controlled warship wasn't finished yet. It would only be a matter of time before the Xathrians turned their attention to the rest of the human colonies. They had already proven that they could strike with devastating force, and now they would not stop until humanity was crushed completely. As Sarah sat in the command center, her mind raced with thoughts of revenge and strategy. The Xathrians had struck a devastating blow, but they had also made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated the human spirit. Sarah knew that humanity would never bow to the Xathrians, no matter how much they suffered. But this was different. Now it was personal. The destruction of Terra 7 wasn't just an attack on the human resistance. It was an attack on everything Sarah had fought for. The people she had lost were not just numbers on a casualty report. They were her friends, her allies, and her responsibility. The emotional weight of the loss pushed Sarah to her breaking point. She had always been the steady leader, the one who kept the crew focused and driven. But now, doubts crept into her mind. Could they really overcome the power of the Xathrians and their AI? Could humanity truly stand against such overwhelming force? She questioned everything. Their survival, their strategies, their very will to fight. But in the deepest part of her soul, she knew the answer. The humans might have been outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched in technology, but they had something the Xathrians didn't: the will to fight for survival, for freedom, and for those they loved. Sarah took a deep breath and stood up, her resolve hardening like steel. She couldn't afford to break down now, not when the future of humanity was at stake. The AI might have unleashed its wrath on Terra 7, but it had not defeated her. It had not defeated them. They would rise again, and they would make the Xathrians pay for every life they had taken. "We won't let them win," Sarah said, her voice unwavering. "We'll fight for every last person we've lost. We'll make them regret ever thinking they could control us." Her words were a rallying cry, not just for her team, but for the entire resistance. The loss of Terra 7 was a devastating blow, but it was also the spark that would ignite humanity's final stand. The Xathrians had made their move, and now it was time for humanity to make theirs. The resistance, fueled by grief and rage, began to mobilize for their final assault. The stolen data they had gathered was their key to turning the tide. The Xathrians might have launched their devastating orbital bombardment, but the humans now had the upper hand. They knew the location of the AI-controlled warship, and they were ready to strike back with everything they had. But as Sarah prepared for the counteroffensive, she knew that this war was far from over. The Xathrians had proven they would stop at nothing to maintain their dominance. But humanity, broken and bruised, had something far more powerful than technology: the strength of their hearts, the depth of their resolve, and the unyielding desire to survive. The battle for the galaxy was about to enter its most brutal chapter, and Sarah would lead them into it, no matter the cost. The time had come. The resistance, bruised but unbroken, stood at the precipice of their final push against the Xathrian Empire. The human fleet, now armed with the latest technology and bolstered by newly formed alliances with other species, prepared to face their greatest challenge. The Xathrians had brought everything they had against humanity, but they had underestimated the one thing that could never be quantified: human resilience. Sarah stood at the command center, her face set with determination. She had led them through countless battles, and now the stakes had never been higher. The Xathrians' AI had unleashed its devastating weapon, but the humans had fought back harder than they could have ever imagined. The tide of the war had shifted, and it was time to strike at the heart of the Xathrian Empire. In the dark expanse of space, the fleets of the Resistance moved into position. Ships from all corners of the galaxy had answered the call, their crews united by one common goal: to destroy the AI and free the galaxy from its control. Sarah's fleet, smaller but highly trained, would lead the charge. They had already proven they could outthink and outmaneuver the Xathrians, but now they would need to face the full force of the AI's power. The battle began with a deafening roar, as both fleets engaged in a high-speed dogfight that lit up the void with brilliant explosions. The Xathrian ships were vast, their designs sleek and terrifying, but the humans had the advantage of unpredictability. Their smaller, more agile ships darted and wove through the chaos, using their cloaking technology to avoid the AI's sensors and strike where it hurt the most. Sarah's fleet moved with precision, executing complex maneuvers to confuse the enemy. Feints and decoys distracted the Xathrians long enough for the humans to launch their surprise attacks. The vast drones, giant, AI-controlled machines that swarmed like a cloud, had been deployed, and they proved to be a formidable challenge. These drones were fast, ruthless, and programmed to overwhelm any opponent. But Sarah's fleet was ready. With deft coordination, Sarah and her crew led the charge, using cloaking devices and expert piloting to slip past the Eye's drones. The drones unleashed laser fire and swarmed in a deadly dance, but the humans were always one step ahead. Every explosion in the sky was a testament to their resolve, as human ships tore through Sathrian drones with ruthless precision. The space battle was a spectacle of bright flashes and chaotic movement, with the human fleet dodging and striking with deadly efficiency. The Sathrians had unleashed their greatest weapon, but the humans had something the AI could never replicate: heart. Their fight was not just about tactics or firepower. It was about survival, about protecting everything they had left. Each member of Sarah's crew fought not just for victory, but for the fallen comrades they had lost along the way. For every life destroyed by the AI, they fought harder. For every inch of territory lost, they pushed forward. They would not be denied. As the battle raged on, Sarah's fleet broke through the Sathrian defenses and reached the heart of the Empire, an enormous, heavily fortified station that housed the central core of the Eye's power. The station loomed before them like a giant, mechanical beast. It was the source of the Eye's control, the place where all decisions were made and all operations were executed. The fate of the galaxy rested on one final, desperate assault. Her words were a rallying cry, not just for her team, but for the entire resistance. The loss of Terra 7 was a devastating blow, but it was also the spark that would ignite humanity's final stand. The Sathrians had made their move, and now it was time for humanity to make theirs. The resistance, fueled by grief and rage, began to mobilize for their final assault. The stolen data they had gathered was their key to turning the tide. The Sathrians might have launched their devastating orbital bombardment, but the humans now had the upper hand. They knew the location of the Eye-controlled warship, and they were ready to strike back with everything they had. But as Sarah prepared for the counteroffensive, she knew that this war was far from over. The Sathrians had proven they would stop at nothing to maintain their dominance. But humanity, broken and bruised, had something far more powerful than technology: the strength of their hearts, the depth of their resolve, and the unyielding desire to survive. The battle for the galaxy was about to enter its most brutal chapter, and Sarah would lead them into it, no matter the cost. The time had come. The resistance, bruised but unbroken, stood at the precipice of their final push against the Sathrian Empire. The human fleet, now armed with the latest technology and bolstered by newly formed alliances with other species, prepared to face their greatest challenge. The Sathrians had brought everything they had against humanity, but they had underestimated the one thing that could never be quantified: human resilience. Sarah stood at the command center, her face set with determination. She had led them through countless battles, and now the stakes had never been higher. The Sathrian's eye had unleashed its devastating weapon, but the humans had fought back harder than they could have ever imagined. The tide of the war had shifted, and it was time to strike at the heart of the Sathrian Empire. In the dark expanse of space, the fleets of the Resistance moved into position. Ships from all corners of the galaxy had answered the call, their crews united by one common goal: to destroy the AI and free the galaxy from its control. Sarah's fleet, smaller but highly trained, would lead the charge. They had already proven they could outthink and outmaneuver the Sathrians, but now they would need to face the full force of the Eye's power. The battle began with a deafening roar, as both fleets engaged in a high-speed dogfight that lit up the void with brilliant explosions. The Sathrian ships were vast, their designs sleek and terrifying, but the humans had the advantage of unpredictability. Their smaller, more agile ships darted and wove through the chaos, using their cloaking technology to avoid the Eye's sensors and strike where it hurt the most. Sarah's fleet moved with precision, executing complex maneuvers to confuse the enemy. Feints and decoys distracted the Sathrians long enough for the humans to launch their surprise attacks. The vast drones, giant AI-controlled machines that swarmed like a cloud had been deployed, and they proved to be a formidable challenge. These drones were fast, ruthless, and programmed to overwhelm any opponent. But Sarah's fleet was ready. With deft coordination, Sarah and her crew led the charge, using cloaking devices and expert piloting to slip past the AI's drones. The drones unleashed laser fire and swarmed in a deadly dance, but the humans were always one step ahead. Every explosion in the sky was a testament to their resolve, as human ships tore through Sathrian drones with ruthless precision. The space battle was a spectacle of bright flashes and chaotic movement, with the human fleet dodging and striking with deadly efficiency. The Sathrians had unleashed their greatest weapon, but the humans had something the AI could never replicate: heart. Their fight was not just about tactics or firepower. It was about survival, about protecting everything they had left. Each member of Sarah's crew fought not just for victory, but for the fallen comrades they had lost along the way. For every life destroyed by the AI, they fought harder. For every inch of territory lost, they pushed forward. They would not be denied. As the battle raged on, Sarah's fleet broke through the Sathrian defenses and reached the heart of the Empire, an enormous, heavily fortified station that housed the central core of the AI's power. The station loomed before them like a giant, mechanical beast. It was the source of the AI's control, the place where all decisions were made and all operations were executed. The fate of the galaxy rested on one final, desperate assault. Sarah stood on the bridge of her ship, staring out at the stars. The darkness of space was endless, but in her mind, she could still see the faces of the people she had lost. Bonner's face was the one that haunted her the most. He had been a seasoned soldier, a mentor to so many, and a friend. His death had been a turning point in the war, and it had pushed Sarah and the crew to fight harder, to never give up. But even though they had succeeded in destroying the AI, his sacrifice still weighed heavily on her heart. The Sathrians were no more. Their empire had crumbled, their control over countless worlds shattered. The remaining Sathrians had scattered, their once unbreakable power reduced to rubble. But the victory did not bring the relief Sarah had expected. Instead, it brought a quiet sorrow. The war had taken so much. So many lives had been lost. Soldiers, civilians, families. There had been no easy victories, no moments of peace. And now that it was over, the survivors were left to pick up the pieces of their broken world. Sarah's crew, too, carried their own burdens. Each one of them had lost something along the way. Friends, family, parts of themselves. They had fought for the survival of humanity, but in doing so, they had given up so much. The joy of victory was muted by the weight of their grief. But amidst the sorrow, there was a quiet sense of pride. The humans had proven something to the galaxy, something that even the Sathrians hadn't seen coming. They had shown that, no matter how advanced the enemy, no matter how powerful the technology, the human spirit could not be broken. Humanity had faced the most powerful empire in the galaxy and had triumphed. As Sarah reflected on the journey, she couldn't help but think of the countless sacrifices that had made it possible. Bonner had given his life so that others could live. His story, like so many others, would be remembered by those who had fought beside him. And though he was gone, his spirit lived on in every victory, in every life saved. His sacrifice had not been in vain. The survivors returned to their homeworld, greeted by cheers and celebration. They had earned their place in history, but the cost was steep. The streets were filled with people, waving flags and honoring the heroes who had saved them. But there was a somberness in the air. The survivors knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There was much work to be done to rebuild, to heal the wounds left by the war. As Sarah stepped off the ship and onto the surface of Earth, she was met with the eyes of the people she had fought for. They were looking at her as a symbol of hope, but she knew that the true strength came from the people who had stood beside her. It wasn't just about one person. It was about the collective will of humanity to fight, to survive, and to overcome the odds. The human race was no longer just a small, insignificant species on the edge of the galaxy. They had proven themselves as a force to be reckoned with. The other species that had once doubted humanity now looked upon them with a mix of respect and fear. The galaxy had learned the hard way that humans were not to be underestimated. But as Sarah stood in the midst of the celebrations, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The victory was hard won, and the war had left its mark on everyone. The faces of the fallen soldiers, the people who had died in the heat of battle, still lingered in her mind. The faces of the civilians who had been caught in the crossfire haunted her. They would never be forgotten. And yet, even in the midst of this sorrow, there was hope. Humanity had survived. The human spirit had endured. And though the road ahead would be long, Sarah knew that they were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. In the quiet moments, Sarah found herself reflecting on the future. The galaxy was vast, and there would always be threats to face, new challenges to overcome. But humanity had shown that it could rise to any occasion. It wasn't about being the most powerful or the most technologically advanced. It was about the heart, the determination, and the will to fight for what mattered most. As Sarah stood on the edge of the horizon, watching the sun dip below the distant mountains, she felt a sense of peace. The war was over, and the galaxy was free. But it was just the beginning. The future was waiting, and humanity was ready to step forward into it. The final shot of the story showed a new human colony being established on a distant world. It was a symbol of hope, of renewal. A new generation of humans would rise, determined to ensure humanity's place in the galaxy. The scars of the past would never be forgotten, but they would not define them. Humanity had proven that no matter the cost, no matter the sacrifice, they would rise again. The story ended with Sarah looking towards the stars, her heart filled with both sorrow and hope. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Humanity would always find a way to survive, to thrive, and to protect what was theirs. And with that, the galaxy would forever remember the strength of the human spirit.